two people. Most of you need no introduction to Joe Langley because he's the reason why we're all in the room today, but I'm going to give you one anyway. Not only is he the chair of the Australian High Speed Rail Association, but as an urban planner and infrastructure advisor for leading firms across Australia, he also developed value capture funding policies, guidelines and business cases for major rail projects for Sydney Metro and Transport New South Wales. Now, joining him will be Dr. Tim Helm, the Director, or coming after him, the Director of Research and Policy for Prosper Australia, an economist with expertise in taxation, housing, land and infrastructure policy with experience in both Victorian and New Zealand Treasury departments. So would you please welcome, you go first. Okay, up you come, Joe. Please welcome Joe.
Thank you, Tracy. Geez, it's hard getting up after John. He sort of steals everything.
Stole it.
Set it up. So we've got two speakers, myself and Tim. And in terms of full disclosure, Tim and I work together on Prosper Australia. I am a member of the board of Prosper Australia, which is one of the leading tax reform advocacy organizations in Australia, probably the world. It's 130 years old. I'm the secretary, and Tim is the research director, and I've been prodding the board to put research time and effort into the work around value capture and affordable housing that I've been involved in. And Tim is a brilliant speaker. I think you'll enjoy what he has to say. So I'm gonna talk about value capture and some of the experiences I've had on high-speed rail and metro. And then Tim is going to talk about how some of those same value capture tools might be applied to housing. So what's the problem we're trying to solve, which is a phrase I learned from Phil. Professor Philip Laird of the University of Wollongong pointed out, as John did, that we've been trying to put together high-speed rail in Australia for 4 decades. And that Australia now leads the world in high-speed rail studies. We love competition, but that's probably not where we wanted to go with it. So the problem that we're trying to solve is that federal and state governments have not yet established the mechanisms for effective value sharing arrangements that can provide an equitable return from the public's investment in infrastructure. And there are some experts that would say we either can't or we don't know how to accurately measure all of the benefits that accrue over a 50-year period on projects like high-speed rail, where there's a huge investment of public money. One of our members, Phil Potterton, is doing some research that he's presenting in New Zealand in the next week or two over his investigations, and just to pick one of the thoughts, which the economists here will have a better sense of than I do, is that the appraisal period that we look at for major transport projects is 30 or 40 years, when these train lines last for over 100. I mean, I now live in the Southern Highlands, and I take the same track that was built in 1859. So these are long life assets, and we ought to be thinking differently about it. The second problem is that we don't have effective measures to produce the returns. We don't have the mechanisms in place, and value capture can help change that. This next diagram is interesting because it comes from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And what it shows is some of the misconceptions, I think, around value capture. Value capture is not a magic pudding. If properly designed, value capture measures the increases in land value and redirects a portion of those increases to the source of the uplift. It can make a significant contribution, as John was pointing out. Uh, the big public agencies like metros and the High-Speed Rail Authority, their projects cause the uplift for two primary reasons. One is through enabling higher density, obviously, around the metro stations. This is the result of a planning change. It's the result of zoning in most cases. And the second factor is that residents and businesses are willing to pay more. There's a willingness to pay more. So these are the two things that go up and down with the quality of the infrastructure that's being designed. These are both instruments or actions that are public actions in granting development rights. And it is my view, and I think a lot of others, that uplift is owned by the public. It's not a private access, or not a private value, as John was pointing out. Otherwise, it becomes windfall gains. Well, what does it mean in terms of magnitude of cost? This is Sydney Metro Northwest, the first automated driverless metro system in Australia. It was the funding came through in 2011, construction commenced in 2014, and operations began in May of 2019. During that period of time, if you look at the blue line there, the value of land around stations increased by over 30%, and that was before the train line opened. The other lines show varying degrees of uplift in the outer rings. The blue ring is 0 to 400 meters, then 400 to 800, and then 800 to 1600. The question again is, who owns this change in value and where should it go? My position is that it's public money, and it should be used to fund that infrastructure and to continue the program of works. Here's an example of two methods that are used in Australia now. In the second column there, we're looking at the special infrastructure contribution this is in place. It's all public information. A $25 billion project, Sydney Metro West, is estimated to cause an increase of private property value of $7.4 billion. New South Wales government decided to put an infrastructure charge in for reasons that are a little bit cloudy, but the charge is actually $15,000 per new dwelling in Pyrmont. That's the only place that this charge is being applied, $200 for non-commercial. It's generating $280 million in value that's going to pay for the Pyrmont Metro Station. That is about 3.8% of the uplift that it's creating, and it's contributing 1% of the cost of the project. If we were to apply the lease variation charge that is currently operating in the ACT, the capture rate would be 75%. If we had that mechanism working here, now these are hypothetical numbers, so you've got to take it not with a grain of salt, but it's a reasonable expectation that it would have generated much more like $5.5 billion in revenue, or 22% of that uplift, and 20% of the cost of the project. So, creating and capturing value, how can we do it for high-speed rail? We need to develop consistent standards for value capture. Some of you may be following the Suburban Rail Project in Melbourne. It's run into some problems with Infrastructure Australia because they can't figure out how they calculated the land value capture mechanism there, which was paying for about 30% of it. It's got some very questionable things going around it if they can't explain that. We also need to require the states to use value capture matching for high-speed rail catchments. This was done on the Sydney Metro Western Sydney Airport line, where the state government matched to the federal government $3 billion under the requirement that the state government had to put in place a value capture mechanism. That led to an extended negotiation between the state and the federal government. the state government finally consented, and they are producing about 1% of the cost of that project from value capture mechanisms, a very poor example. And then finally, affordable housing, which Tim is going to talk about now. So what our organization has done is produce a value capture policy statement, which we hope Tim and his team will look at. We've got copies for our elected members of Parliament to take and have a look at as well, because this is a way that we can take the burden off the taxpayer and close the gap in making this project a reality. So I'll turn over to Tim now and let him talk about how we might be able to help with the housing problem with this mechanism. Tim.
Thank you very much, Joe, and I'm pleased to join this confusion of Tims between Tim Williams and Tim Parker, and I'll be number 3. Now, I'm not sure who praises the speaker before them and then spooks the speaker following them and then delivers a speech like that, but thank you very much, Joe, for the added pressure. I'm going to start by apologising because I know I'm for several reasons. One, I don't know if this will be a brilliant speech for 95% of you. The 5% of you that are interested in the economics of land might disagree. Secondly, so I come from an economics background. I'm a tax and housing economist. I work for this small think tank that spooks these ideas, which are sometimes called Georgist ideas, of using the value created in land to fund the public service generally, not just infrastructure. The reason I'm apologising is I'm not immersed in the high-speed rail space the way that you all are, so I hope I don't tread on any toes with anything I'm saying. And indeed, what I'm going to do here is try and redirect the conversation around value capture away from being centred in the infrastructure space. And I would like to pitch that this is something we can think about as a tool to improve housing affordability as well. So the story really is, in part, how you can find some money to pay for high-speed rail and other major infrastructure using value capture tools. But it's also a different story about a deep unfairness that's going on in our housing markets. John's already spoken about it more eloquently than I can. The essence is that the way we do our planning in Australia, our planning systems are giving away billions in handouts to landowners, which is essentially a handover of public assets without getting a cent in return. So those billions could be going to those who need housing most, or could be going towards delivering valuable infrastructure, or to both. This could be funding housing support delivered in line with major infrastructure to ease the politics of funding the combination. Excuse me. So we think, myself and my colleagues, Henry Williams from the Policy Institute and Cameron Murray, who have been working on this research together, we think there's a really huge opportunity where putting, as we call it, a fair price on development rights could be a game changer for housing and could be part of the solution to high-speed rail funding. So this is our value capture proposal. Really, the prior two speakers have alluded to this, but when we're talking about value capture, to really hammer the point home, we're talking about the question of how can we fund projects, major projects like high-speed rail, in ways that are sustainable, fair, fiscally sustainable, fair, and economically efficient, non-distorting, that is. And in particular, can we avoid excessive burden on the general taxpayer by funding projects out of the rise in land values when projects are delivered, or significantly when land is rezoned? This is value capture. You may be familiar also with the terms betterment taxation or beneficiary pays funding to distinguish this approach from a user pays funding model, which, as any transport economist or anyone who's thought about it will tell you, pushed to its limits will throttle the demand that you're seeking to create. So we three have formed a view about how we might enact this principle in light of the difficult politics of capturing revenue from land. And in particular, we think it's right to focus on the development process as the key entry point for a value capture strategy through pricing development rights. And we think that out of that revenue, redirecting some significant funding to housing support as well as infrastructure could shift the political incentives at play. Where are we? So I've been working in and around this space for a while. I think for a decade I've watched discussion around value capture along with John, watching this be debated and seeing states go some small way towards enacting this principle, but not nearly far enough or fast enough. And I would really affirm that what's emerging in Victoria with the suburban rail loop is probably not a great case study in how to raise funding for major infrastructure from value capture. And the problem as I see it is that our thinking about value capture typically begins with a funding problem and involves mechanisms tied to specific projects or precincts. And that's necessarily a very manual process at the infrastructure planning stage that becomes politically compromised. Yet it's the dominant way we think about value capture. It's synonymous with value capture, this idea that as you're planning a project, you think about how to fund it. It's funding together, value capture as funding projects by cobbling together revenue from various different instruments. And we think another way to frame value capture is around fixing an equity problem, a policy failure, and that problem being the giveaway of land through the development process, which of course occurs alongside major projects. So a different question here is how we can fairly price development rights and what that can buy us if we do it systematically as revenue policy, isolated from infrastructure policy. I think about this as value capture as pricing public assets. If 20% of the political pain can get us 80% of the result, let's start there. That's our take. And that means focusing on the role of planning, system and land development without focusing too much on trying to capture benefits of projects for land that remains in existing use. So we think there should be a fair price on development rights. What are development rights? Well, this is probably familiar to you. You own a freestanding house on a block of land. Your freehold title gives you exclusive use of the land indefinitely. You've got a right to sell or lease or bequeath that property right to somebody else. But your title obviously does not mean you can do whatever you want on that property. And in particular, if you want to build more dwellings, you need to seek a planning permit. And this is what we mean by development rights. Importantly, these rights reside with the community, legally, morally, unless and until the state gives them over into private hands through issuing a planning permit. These rights are obviously highly valuable, and across most of Australia, the current approach is to give them away. We've developed some original estimates of that giveaway based on scaling up data from the ACT, which has the least variation charge, and we estimate the value of community-owned development rights being given away is in the ballpark of $11 billion a year across Australia, or more than $4 billion a year in New South Wales alone. To frame this, just imagine the reaction if this giveaway was happening with assets that people had a better grasp. If, for example, a few years ago, instead of selling its 49% stake in WestConnex for $11 billion, the New South Wales government had just handed it over for free, with the people of New South Wales getting nothing. Well, that happens to that magnitude every year across Australia when it comes to development rights, but it happens without controversy. Who's benefiting? In simple terms, it's the owners of developable land, as we've discussed. The benefit mostly flows to landowners with large holdings of agricultural land, take the airport, on the urban fringe, or industrial lands in urban areas. And this one is Fisherman's Bend in Melbourne as a good example of the latter. It's about 500 hectares of former industrial land on the right bank of the Yarra River running up to the city. Now, around a decade ago, it was rezoned and planning permits were issued on many properties. And a report by Prosper, before my time, but my think tank, found that, on average, properties receiving a planning permit saw their land value rise by about 400%. And that's not greenfields, that's brownfields land. And in total, the rights given away from in that one section of Melbourne were worth more than $4 billion. Now, it's important to note these giveaways are a honeypot for corruption and cronyism. Cam Murray, one of the co-authors in this work, examined one major rezoning in Queensland for his PhD thesis, which he wrote up in a book. That rezoning created $700 million in land value uplift, and well-connected landowners, as he defined them, captured $400 million of that. These well-connected owners happened to own 75% of the land just inside the rezoned areas, but only 12% outside. Now, our view is simply that the community should get a fair price when these rights are transferred from public ownership to private. Now, the ACT in Victoria have had a go at doing this specifically focused on the development process rather than as a broader value capture for infrastructure policy as in New South Wales. So the ACT has what's called the lease variation charge, which has been in place since 1971. Now, the word lease refers to the ACT's leasehold titles, but while those titles appear distinct from freehold titles elsewhere, in practice they actually operate very similarly. There are no more annual lease payments in the ACT. That was abolished in 1971. You buy land with an upfront charge, just like the price you pay to buy land from a prior owner elsewhere in Australia. And really both systems, leasehold and freehold, share the same key characteristic that it's the state's prerogative to assign development rights to title holders, and therefore the state has the power to charge for these rights. The lease variation charge is very simple. If you want to build additional dwellings, you need to pay a charge for those rights, and that charge is set at 75% of the increase in the value of land due to the rights. The ACT also has an unusual system for greenfields land. A government agency is the sole owner, which ensures the community gets really full value for greenfield development rights when that's converted to residential land. Now, the windfall gains tax of Victoria operates quite differently. Rather than charging for the development right to be exercised, it applies a tax of up to 50% on the uplift in value that occurs when and at the point of a rezoning happening. That uplift, of course, occurs because rezoning is a signal of, and it's a prerequisite for, development rights later through the planning permit process, later being handed over unpriced. Now, the tax rate in Victoria is lower, but it's important the base is much narrower. The ACT price is based on the full increase in land value from changing use. But Victoria's tax base falls a long way short of that. In particular, where land is rising in value through time due to a growing expectation of rezoning, then that appreciation is not included within the tax base for the windfall gains tax. And when there's a significant uplift in value associated with the final stage, the planning permit, which can often be the case with flexible planning systems, subsequent to that rezoning, that value is also not captured. So the upshot in Victoria is that the windfall gains tax is expected to raise around $100 million this year, which by our estimate is not even 5% of the total value of development rights being handed out each year in that state. It's about a quarter of what the ACT raises every year, despite the discrepancy in size between those jurisdictions. So we've been looking at this, thinking about this. We've concluded really that the optimal system for charging for development rights, which we think is the best way to tackle the value capture problem for transport and for housing, that system should really adopt the key features of the ACT's model, the lease variation charge. And that means four things. Firstly, we're putting a fair price on development rights, and you only pay that price if you choose to develop. So there's a really important distinction, critically important distinction between a tax and a price. A tax is compulsory, but a price is optional. You only pay it if you choose to engage in the transaction where you are acquiring something from the state, something held in reserve for the public. So compared to a tax, a price is both fairer, it's only paid by those who choose to develop, and is more likely to be perceived as fair. And this approach also minimises the number of payers, which from a pragmatical political viewpoint really matters. Similarly, from that same viewpoint, the second point is that the developer should hand over the money. Now, an economist will tell you that regardless of who legally hands over the money, the burden, the economic burden of a price or a tax will fall on the landowner in the form of lower land value. But it does matter politically that the charge is handed over by the developer. And developers already pay a range of fees and charges, and some developers are likely to pay a development rights charge many times per year across many properties, meaning, again, fewer taxpayers. Under Victoria's tax, in contrast, the liability is created when the rezoning happens, then a tax bill is sent to affected landowners. And even though they don't need to pay that immediately, people don't like getting tax bills, even deferred tax bills. So carve-outs have been deemed necessary from that tax. The windfall gains tax doesn't apply to uplift of less than $100,000 or to properties already zoned residential. And those are huge carve-outs. They narrow the tax base significantly. Third point, we think the charge should capture, like in the ACT, 75% of the full uplift in value. From first principles, the optimal price, of course, would be 100% of the value of the asset being handed. That would be a fair price for what's being sold, a fair price for the community to receive, and it would be consistent with the price you pay if you buy a property with those use rights already attached. But in the real world, we are relying on imperfect land value estimates to set these charges. So pricing below 100% is necessary to ensure we don't accidentally impede development with the wrong numbers. And we think 75% strikes the right balance. Final point here, you'll know if you're familiar with the ACT that we think charges for most development rights should be specified in advance to provide certainty to developers. So this table you can see hopefully here from the ACT is a government-published table which makes clear ahead of time what development rights in different places cost. So for example, adding one dwelling to a block attracts a charge of $250,000 in Barton compared to less than $100,000 in Belconnen at the fringe. And the more dwellings you add, the lower the charge per dwelling, and that reflects the diseconomies of scale in building construction. So this codification happened in the ACT around a decade ago in response to developers wanting certainty in advance. It's also an issue developers have raised consistently with Victoria's windfall gains tax. Okay, final slide here. The numbers on the screen are our estimates of how much revenue could be raised across Australia and in New South Wales by putting what we call a fair price on development rights, ACT style. Across Australia, more than $8 billion a year, and in New South Wales, more than $3 billion a year. Obviously, there are plenty of ways to spend this. Infrastructure funding could certainly be one use of this revenue, and how the money is spent will be up to states. But I want to give you one example of what's being given away, expressed in the very common currency of houses, to illustrate what this type of approach could do for housing affordability. If, for instance, each state set up a fair housing fund or the equivalent and used the money to provide help to those currently locked out, the housing have-nots. With $8 billion, you could abolish stamp duty across Australia for every single first-home buyer and increase our social housing stock by 50%. And that means making available an additional 220,000 social housing dwellings. And in New South Wales, the same way, you could abolish stamp duty for every single first-time buyer and make available 100,000 social housing dwellings, which is a 2/3 increase in the stock. So with what we give away to those that already own land and are already doing very well, the housing have-lots, we could call them, we could fund these types of policies by putting a fair price on those rights. We can fund these types of policies for the housing have-nots and siphon off a portion to pay for infrastructure. So we think politically this framing, we're making very obvious points and spruiking a known model, but this framing around a solution to housing affordability problems we think can be an important one.
Cool.
Now, final point really just before I finish is that New South Wales has obviously gone through a process recently of implementing a new system of infrastructure charges, and other states have these systems in place. Question arises, does it make sense to have both infrastructure charges and a charge for development rights? And we think so, yes. It's a debatable point, but we think infrastructure charges could reflect a user pays approach and be based on cost, particularly the standard infrastructure that enables and facilitates the development. But in many cases, those costs don't go anywhere near capturing the benefit that flows to landowners when development rights are transferred. Of course, in practice, when infrastructure charges are in place, that will affect the market value of the land from which the value of development rights and the price is calculated. So there isn't any risk of, if you like, taking too much with having two charges sitting alongside each other. Our revenue estimates, in case you're curious, are based on ACT data, which to great extent already accounts for infrastructure costs. So we think these estimates are relevant as an extrapolation from the ACT to elsewhere. I wasn't going to cover that one today, but I'll back it off here, and I'll just say I'll wrap up here, and that's our proposal. We think that putting a fair price on development rights could, and redirecting some of those billions into housing as well as infrastructure could be a game changer for housing. In relation to high-speed rail, I suppose the obvious application would be to earmark a portion of the revenue due to that project making development rights more valuable, especially station precincts, earmark that portion to the project itself as a clear and fair means of using value capture funding, but embedded in more general revenue policy, not a standalone bespoke approach. And I'd also note that social housing spend funded out of this money could be targeted to high-speed rail precincts to accelerate development of those precincts and to ensure the benefits of the project are widely shared and are seen to be widely shared, which could be important for political acceptability. So that's a good point to stop. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Now, what I'm going to do